Okay, Chapter 5, Biodiversity. This whole entire unit, Chapter 5 and Chapter 18, we're going to do is about biodiversity. So here we go. Biodiversity or diversity, there's three different types. Ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. Ecosystem diversity or habitat diversity is the variation within a habitat or an area. Is it all forest? Is it forest with a river and ponds and a meadow? The more variation you have within your habitat or your area, your ecosystem, the more different roles, jobs, places for different species. So the variety of species you can have. So that's always a good thing. Species diversity. How many different species do you have in an area? The more species you have, usually the better. The more complex your food webs can be and stuff. So species diversity is just the number of species in a given area. Genetic diversity is the variation within the genetics in a population. So what kind of genes are there? What kind of variety are there? That's very important when you're talking about animals surviving disease and different situations. The more variety you have of genetics, the better. Okay. Define a species. What is a species? A species is a group of organisms that look the same or look very similar that can interbreed, so they can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. The producing fertile offspring is the key point. You have to be able to produce a fertile offspring in order to be considered the same species. You can have different species who reproduce. As unethical as it is, people have bred tigers and lions and got ligers or tigons, depending on which one's male and which one's female kind of thing. Depends on how they name them. This is completely unethical, but the liger is actually sterile. You have two different species you're breeding, they can produce an offspring, but because they're different species, the offspring will be sterile, meaning that the offspring cannot produce any offspring of its own. Okay, so when we measure biodiversity, we measure species richness, which is the number of species in a given area, and also species evenness, how evenly are they distributed. So species richness is just the number. So if you look at the picture in the bottom, they both have 4 species. So evenness or richness wise, they're the same. They both have 4 species. But community 1 is a lot more even, meaning that basically each of the trees takes up 25%, whereas in community 2, species A has a much greater number than the others, and so it's kind of uneven. So if you have a bunch of species in a given area and they all basically have the same number of individuals within that species, that's very even. Even is better, because if you get down to very low numbers, reproduction becomes an issue. If you only have 3 types of trees, what if all 3 of them are male or female and they can't reproduce? So you want high numbers and you want a lot of species. That makes for better biodiversity. Okay, this is the Shannon-Weiner Index. It's a very complicated formula. For this reason, you will never see it on the AP exam because you guys can't use a calculator. But it's the sum of P sub I times the natural log of P sub I. P sub I happens to be N sub I divided by capital N. The little n, lowercase n sub I, is the number of individuals within that species. So if there was 6 squirrels, that would be the 6. And N is the total number of organisms you counted in the area. So if I counted squirrels, raccoons, rabbits, and armadillos in an area, and I counted 20 animals, my capital N would be my 20. And then the individual number of each of the things, so if I had 6 squirrels, the lowercase n sub I would be my 6. So 6 divided by 20 would give me my P sub I. And then I would plug the P sub I into the P sub I times the natural log of P sub I. And do that for each of the 4 species and then add them together and I get my value. So it's a complicated thing, but I'll run through it in class. How come I have another blank screen? Okay, don't hit enter. Okay, the other one that's easy is the Simpson Index. N is still the total numbers of organisms I counted, so my 20 critters. And then the lowercase n is the number of individuals for the given species. So for squirrels, 6. So 6 times 6 minus 1 is 5. So 6 times 5. And it would be 20 times 19. And you do the math. So, okay. Okay, evolution. Always a touchy subject. Evolution occurs on a population level, not an individual. So you're never going to go to sleep one night and wake up and have wings on your back. Sorry to tell you. As cool as it would be, you're not going to. It's basically evolution is just a change in gene frequency over a period of time within a population, which does not mean that there's any serious changes in it. You're not going to necessarily get wings or grow a tail or anything like that. It's just the frequency of the genes change, which means we as a population could be getting taller because of gene frequency changing and that kind of thing. There's different things that can create new diversity within the genetic makeup of a population. And those are things like mutation and recombination. Mutation is just a mistake when the DNA is copied within cells as they reproduce or as they split. Most of those mutations are fatal, but if you have a bird that's typically green and a mutation happens and the offspring is now blue, if for some reason that blue was favorable, that blue bird actually survived and stuff, they would continue to pass off that new color into the population. And over time, if all the birds turned blue, that's evolution. That's a change in the population. Recombination can occur. This again occurs during duplication. A piece of one chromosome breaks off and attaches to another chromosome, so they kind of reorder, and it can create new traits, which over time can lead to a change in the population, because new genotype means new phenotype, and that phenotype can lead to a change in the population, but only if it's favorable. Some other ways we do evolution, changing. Artificial selection is one done by humans, where we intentionally breed to get certain traits. Our dogs are all dogs, but we have bred them to have different breeds, to have different sizes, colors, shapes, that kind of thing. And that's all done from artificial selection by changing gene frequency within the population. So a Chihuahua and a Great Dane are both dogs. They're both same species, but because of what we've done through selective breeding, we've changed their appearance. And we've done that with a lot of animals and with a lot of our plants. We are unintentionally doing it right now with a lot of bacteria and creating drug-resistant bacteria and insects, pesticide-resistant insects, because of this. And that's why I have my no hand sanitizer policy. And that's why actually just recently the government actually banned antibacterial soaps, because the fact is we're just making the bacteria stronger rather than actually making us any healthier. If you have any questions about that, I'll cover it in class. Okay, natural selection. I hope you guys are all familiar with natural selection. This is when the environment determines which individuals survive and reproduce, therefore changing the genetic population, evolving or having the population change. Usually this has to occur due to a pressure. It's Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. You should be familiar with it. Hopefully you already are from bio, but I'll run through it very quickly. Okay, so the key things are with the natural selection is more offspring have to be produced than can survive. So you have to have lots and lots of babies. Okay, and not all those babies can survive. Some of the offspring have to die. So, because if you had all the offspring survived, the ones with the good traits and ones with the bad traits would all survive, and you would not have evolution occur, any change in your natural selection. You also have to have a variation within traits in your population. If all your birds are green and they're always green, then you can't have evolution. But if you have green birds, yellow birds, blue birds, there could be a preference for one of those colors, and you could have a change over time. Due to predation, you know, the yellows can't hide as well, so they got picked off, and pretty soon there's no more yellows anymore and that kind of thing. And again, the individuals with those favorable traits, genetic traits, they have to be genetic, have to also survive and reproduce and pass those along to their offspring, because if that's not going to happen, it doesn't work. Also, it has to be something genetic. It can't be something like with primates and tool use, because that's actually taught. That's not a genetic, that's taught, so that would never be evolution. Natural selection requires a pressure. Something has to cause a trait to be more favorable than another. It could be a physiological stressor like climate change, drought, a flood, something like that. It can be predation, and it can be competition. Predation and competition are some of the big ones, especially predation. And we're going to actually do a lab on that. Okay, so in natural selection, you have a combination of traits that increases your fitness. Fitness is the ability to survive and reproduce. If you survive, if you reproduce, then you are going to pass those traits on to your offspring. That is considered adaptation. You're changing or the gene frequency is changing due to a pressure. So you're adapting to a new situation. So evolution can be just an adaptation to a new situation. So the example from your book is about feeding and its predation. Basically, the fish has a preference for larger sized crustaceans, and so over time the crustaceans, the large ones, get eaten, so the small ones don't, and they pass off the small trait, and pretty soon you have all your crustaceans are little. Okay. Divergent evolution. This is when two organisms start off very similar and have a common ancestor but become less alike over time. What's something that's divergent evolution? Oh, probably the predecessor of bats. Marine mammals and normal mammals, there's a divergent evolution there. Convergent evolution is when two organisms come from, do not have a common ancestor but have a similar trait, like birds and insects both have flight. Birds and bats both have flight, but yet they come from a different ancestor. Evolution through random process. Again, we already covered mutation. Just a random thing that causes a favorable trait to occur through just a mutation, and that favorable trait takes over. You can have genetic drift, which is a change in genetic composition in the population as a result of random mating. This often occurs in small populations because it's far harder to find mates. So some of your genotypes are lost because they can't find mates. If your population is too large, you usually don't get this. Usually we get this in smaller things, smaller groups. So here's an example showing basically your mutation, and then your genetic drift usually occurs in smaller populations. It's more prevalent. Bottleneck, interesting thing. When a population gets reduced greatly, very rapidly, usually there's a loss of genetic diversity. In the new population, there's going to be a different gene frequency, and so you're going to lose some genes and stuff. Cheetahs are having a huge problem because they've gone through a bottleneck. So they're much more susceptible to disease, unfortunately. Founder effect is when you take a small piece of a population and resubmit it. This is totally what happens on islands or zoos. When you have that small piece of the population go over, they usually do not have 100% or even 90% of the genetic makeup of the initial population, and so you lose some of your genetic variation. So here's an example. So there's your bottleneck. Everybody else except for 3 survived, and those 3 are now the parents of all the rest, and you can lose certain genes and gene types and variation that way. And then of course the founder effect is kind of the same thing, except the others didn't die off, but like a little group of your original population ends up on an island, or they end up in a zoo, or they end up somewhere isolated from the rest of the population, and over time that they will end up being different from that founding population. Okay, we're going to wrap it up there for this first one. Hope everything's going well. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.